Thank you. Well, this is really exciting for me to be here at Fairfield University. I want to talk to you about things that have made a big impression on my life, things that kind of have been seminal moments to help me understand the events that are often unpredictable, that often have unintentional consequences. I can remember in 1969, I went to a lecture at MoMA, Museum of Modern Art in New York City, and I was listening to the famous anthropologist, Dr. Margaret Mead, and she was talking about lots of things, and I was kind of half listening until all of a sudden she said, and for those of you who are marketers, the most important fact, and suddenly my ears perked up, she said the most important fact is the emergence of a new, large, affluent, middle-class consumer. And she said, I call them the baby boomers. And in 1969, the baby boomers were young. The baby boomers are retiring today. And the baby boomers are the ones that we eventually called the Pepsi generation. And when we were trying to market against Coke, they had incredibly great advertising, but it was all about the product. In those days, it was, Coke is the real thing. A bottle of Coke and a beautiful screen, cold water rushing by. And so we said, let's focus on the experience of this new, affluent, young, middle-class consumer, the baby boomers, who had discretionary income. In fact, Dr. Mead said, this is the first group of its size ever to have this much discretionary income. Now, I'm old enough to remember the U.S. before there was an affluent middle class. And I remember growing up when people didn't think about all the different kinds of products and services we had today. There were no fast food restaurants. There were only A&P grocery stores. There weren't any big mass shopping centers and things of this sort. And so this affluent middle class, giving them the aspiration at exactly the moment that color television was appearing in the early 1970s, when screens were going in television sets from small black and white screens, about 10 inches in size, to 20 inches in color. So we asked our advertising agency to build us commercials that never talked about the product, only talked about the experience that we thought that these baby boomers would want to aspire to. So they went out to Hollywood, and they went to the best motion picture directors, and they said, make us 60-second movies about people having fun, doing things that are really neat to do, like water skiing and riding dirt bikes and sailing kites and all kinds of things like that. And that became the Pepsi generation. That was the first lifestyle television campaign ever, and it's still out there today, many years later. Well, I want to talk about this middle class because something's going on in the world that's pretty significant for all of us who are interested in marketing. For example, the middle class now is all about conspicuous consumption. And if you think back to an earlier day, back when we were creating the Pepsi generation, someone could graduate from high school. They could expect that with medium skills, they could get high pay in a job in an assembly plant, let's say, and that was a career decision. Well, those jobs don't exist anymore. And we've now seen that this conspicuous lifestyle for many people just isn't affordable anymore. In fact, we see gridlock politically in the country because there's arguments about, is the American dream about the opportunity to go and create a future for yourself, which is like the future that the middle class, those baby boomers, look forward to now, over 40 years later? Or is the American dream about a right and entitlement that we should get as Americans? And I'm not going to debate that issue, but I want to talk about the implications of it from a marketing standpoint, because the conspicuous middle class model just isn't affordable for most of us anymore. So we're used to, over the last 40 years, of the middle class model being what we export to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has said, we love it. We love your movies. We love your television shows. We love to read the magazines about your celebrities. We like to hear the success stories of your companies. And yet, the world is changing. And I do a lot of business out in Southeast Asia. The ASEAN countries, those are the South Asia countries south of China. It includes Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, countries like that. The estimates are 635 million people are aspiring to be part of a new middle class in those ASEAN countries by the year 2020. Now, 635 million. Well, we have 317 million people in total in the US. So that's more than double the total population of the United States. And their model of middle class, while they got inspired by some of the things that they saw in the American model of middle class, it wasn't affordable. So their model of the middle class is based on what we call the frugal model of a middle class lifestyle. And it doesn't mean that you can't have the same products and services. It just means that you have to rethink how those products and services are offered. For example, there is a major new industry being created in South Asia about discount airlines. There are 7 new airlines created in the last 5 years that are selling tickets to people to make often their first airplane flight, and they are perhaps 20% or less the cost of the more traditional established carriers. And no one knows where that's all going to sort out. If you want to have an automobile in that part of the world, it's not 2 automobiles to a family. It's 1 automobile, maybe, and probably a motorcycle or a tut-tut. And the car probably costs under $10,000. You don't have a 2,300 square foot suburban house. In fact, the only country in the world that really has a suburban topology is the US. What you have is people living in cities, in flats that are typically about 700, 800 square feet. So many of the same products, but a very different frugal model. For example, we're getting ready in one of my companies to introduce a new smartphone in South Asia. The price points for an Apple smartphone in that part of the world, the iPhone, the entry price is more like $400, and there's no subsidy from the carriers as we have in this country. The entry price for a Samsung is about $250. Well, there's a whole market down there of $100 or less. And so we're focused on that $100 or less market, and we own a number of companies that are in the supply chain. We build products over in Shenzhen, China, and so we've learned how to build a product that may not be quite the full experience you would get with a Samsung or an Apple iPhone, but it meets the requirements of a very large number of consumers. And other people are looking at those kinds of opportunities too. We have a business in India that's all about replacement tires. Why? Because new cars come with tires, but there's no established replacement tire industry, and the roads are terrible. And so the tires wear out really quickly. And so we bring tires in from Korea and Taiwan, and we sell them for half the price of the name brand tires in India. So these are different ways of thinking about marketing to a middle class, but it's a price model that says it's got to be a disruptive price versus things that we're accustomed to. So here's what I think about back here in the US. There's something going on in technology which is bigger than anything I've ever experienced in the 30 years that I've been around high tech. And let me tell you about it. You've all heard about cloud computing and Moore's Law. Moore's Law is that the performance of a microprocessor doubles about every 18 to 24 months based on the number of transistors you can put on a given area of a wafer chip. And that's been predictable year after year after year for 43 years. But we've now seen that with cloud computing, that it's possible to take many processors, put them on many boards, put those many boards into many racks, put them in the data centers, and we're able to have a dramatic increase in processing performance. So it's no longer a linear projection of how much performance is going to be increased, but it's truly exponential. And we're seeing processing performance today that was literally impossible to even have imagined 5 or 6 years ago. And what made that possible was we learned how to parse the software code so it could be executed on different processors simultaneously as opposed to sequentially. And that was a major change. And so the ability to process massive amounts of information on a scale that was inconceivable even a few years ago, and will get even bigger in the future. But not only is it getting easier to do processing in these cloud data centers, but the cost of storage has dropped from $2 a gigabyte down to 25 cents. And if you go back to the year 2008, the estimate are that there were 800 exabytes of data in the world. Assume everybody knows what an exabyte is. That's 10 to the 18th. And if you don't know 10 to the 18th, let me give you another way of thinking about it. Imagine a DVD filled with as much data as you could get on it. Then imagine getting as many DVDs as you could fit into a 747 aircraft if you squeezed in every available space. And now multiply that by 15,456. And that's 1 exabyte. And there were 800 exabytes estimated in 2008 in the world. The estimates are by 2020 there'll be 35,000 exabytes. 800, 35,000. Cost of storage, $5. In 2 years down to 25 cents. Exponential growth in the processing performance. And so cloud computing, for a while, people said, hey, I do my software on the cloud. That was sort of as, I'm pretty special. Guess what? It's about as special as electricity. It's a utility. It's the way everything is done today. So it's kind of like just a commodity to be on the cloud. Now, you may have heard the Internet of Things. In fact, John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco, was quoted a few years ago saying that he was forecasting by 2020 there would be 20 billion wireless connected devices available on the internet by 2020, which seems like a big number till about a year and a half later. John said, nope, there's going to be 30 billion wireless connected devices by 2020. And then he came back about a year later and he said, nope, it's actually going to be 40 billion by 2020. Now he's raised that number again to 50 billion wireless connected devices by 2020, and he's said publicly that he thinks that by around 2025, that cumulatively there'll be $19 trillion of GDP around the world that will be influenced by these billions and billions of mobile devices. Well, what are they? Because there are only 6 billion cell phones on the planet. There's 7 billion people. So how can you have 50 billion wireless connected devices? What they are sensors. And I came into the personal computer industry at the early days of the microprocessor. Remember Moore's law kept getting more and more powerful? Well, now we're in the early days of sensors. And sensors are getting smarter, they're getting cheaper, they're able to communicate with each other wirelessly, and most of it is machine to machine. Some sensors are vision sensors, some measure heat, some measure sound, some measure bodily functions. So I have an accelerometer on right now that can measure my footsteps, convert it into caloric burn, and I can tell how many calories I've consumed in one day. So there are lots of different sensor type products, and they're going to be more and more pervasive in everywhere in our lives. So over here we've got cloud computing. No longer special, a utility, but increasing at extraordinary exponential rates. And over here, we've got maybe 50 billion sensors connected machine to machine for the most part, which are running because of this powerful cloud utility. And then we have the third monumental change, and that is the change of data. Now, when I was in the personal computer industry, everything was about structured data. Structured data means that with a database where you could take a few attributes, do a correlation analysis, and say that look at X and Y, measure over time, and be able to say, look at the trends. What if we change these variables? What would happen? Everything was structured. And that's the way data went on for the last 40 years. But today, we're in a very different world. It's about unstructured data. It's taking data from anywhere. It can be GPS location data. It can be tweets from Twitter. It can be images. It can be photographs. It could be data from any of these billions of sensors. Massive amounts of data. And guess what? It's really cheap to process this. It's really cheap to store all this data. Big companies like Google, Facebook, they don't throw anything away. Nothing. It's all being stored. And so with unstructured data, we have an entirely different type of mathematics. When I was in graduate school, I studied mathematics, and I did things like Markov chain analysis and Monte Carlo game theory and Bayesian statistical model. These are all probability math concepts. And it was academic at that time. There was nothing practical you could do. There were no computers fast enough to even run it. So now we're at a time when it's completely practical. And so with unstructured data, we're able to use probability statistics, and that's why the data scientist is on the high priority of the totem pole of importance in engineering, because they're the ones who know how to create the algorithms, interpret the data, and to be able to work in a world of probabilities. And that's what big data is all about. So now, how do you put that to work back to marketing? Well, when I think of the structured world, I think of Walmart. Walmart is a very structured model. It took what had been around for years before, and it scaled it up. So the stores were big. The number of people working in those stores were even bigger. Walmart has 1.4 million employees in the US, about 2 million employees around the world. They became the largest importer of products in the world. In fact, Walmart is as big as many large countries in terms of comparing its revenue to their GDP. And yet, a newer company came along called Amazon, and they totally changed the game. And what did they do? They said, we're going to create an exceptional customer experience, and how are we going to do that? We're going to use data analytics. By the way, they're going to use those powerful cloud computing utility I talked about. They're going to use massive amounts of information, unstructured data, from their customers and watching everything else out over the internet. They're going to offer products that are bigger than anything that Walmart could offer because they're virtual. And so they have an incredible customer experience at one end with a very simple user experience. A one-click to the shopping cart and a one-click to purchase from there. Now, at the other end of the value chain, and always think in marketing, it's not about an event, it's about a system. Think at the other end of the supply chain, where Walmart has retail stores. Amazon is building across this nation, city after city, giant supply centers. Why? Because they want to have same-day delivery. So you order something, and you can get it delivered the same day. So what makes the Walmart model different from the Amazon model? Because Amazon is selling products at even lower prices than Walmart. And Walmart built its business around disruptive price. And yet Amazon is coming in with even more disruptive price, with an even wider number of products. So how are they doing it? Well, there's very little in terms of people between the technology at the front end, which is the customer experience, using predictive analytics, using massive cloud computing, processing and storage capability, using catalogs and being able to figure out if you bought this last time, well, here's what you might want to buy next time. So that's all at the front end, customer experience. And then at the other end, lots of people in these supply centers, but very little in between, just technology. So we saw during the growth of Walmart how robots came in and could do the heavy lifting. Well, guess what? Now we have robots that are smart and they can do the heavy thinking and they can do the workflow. And many of the things that were higher skilled and white collar jobs, remember I said that the medium skill, high paying jobs on an assembly line for a career, that doesn't exist anymore. We're starting to see the hollowing out of those middle management jobs. So what does a middle management look like? Well, my experience with middle management is that they are empowered by their organizations in these big organizations where everything is about scale. They are empowered to say no and rarely ever empowered to say yes. And that is a way of protecting what you have, but it's also a way of missing the radical changes that are going on if you're going to want to take that frugal model of marketing that is happening with middle-class consumers in other parts of the world, such as my South Asia example, and you're starting to see that it is possible to offer a great customer experience and disruptive price, but it is going to change the way organizations are constructed. So it creates a dilemma. And here's the dilemma. 70% of our economy is made up of consumer spend. So if you start to lose a lot of those middle jobs, we actually are at the lowest number of working people in America in the last 40 years. You know, when you hear the reports from the government on unemployment, they report it the way they want to report it. They leave out a lot of the interesting information. So they may tell you, but they don't emphasize it, that the number of people actually employed is going down. So it isn't just the unemployment figure, 6.7%. It's the 62.8 million people, or 62.8% of the population that is actually working. It's the lowest we've been at in 40 years. And when they look at unemployment, they only count people who are actively looking for jobs. So if you stop looking for a job 5 months ago, you don't get counted. So what we're seeing is that there's a dilemma that we got to have people with jobs making money so they can spend money if we're going to be a middle-class, consumer-driven economy. So how do we solve that problem? And I believe the way we solve that problem is we have to rethink how we get growth back in the economy. Now, I can't imagine that this is a solution that's ever going to come out of Washington. And it makes no difference what your politics are. I don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent. It's irrelevant. What's relevant is that you can't expect a political system that is largely influenced by special interests, that is largely based on legacies that have been around a long time, to necessarily come up with the things that are going to be important to grow the economy. Most of the jobs, if not all the jobs of growth in the U.S., come from smaller business. So my sense is that if we're going to solve the problem, we, the citizens of the country, we're going to solve it by getting growth with new companies being created, getting growth from the existing small companies being able to feel comfortable to hire more people, to get access to growth working capital and things of that sort. So to me, marketing can be a big part of the solution in the free enterprise model if we can start to give people the inspiration to want to be part of this entrepreneurial world. And there are a couple of things I'd like to point out just as an example. One, there was an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal. In fact, there were two articles that really caught my eye. One was about the U.S. Postal Service. And they have done an extensive survey, and they have come back with the idea that they can take this big asset of all of these people and branch post offices they have, and they're going to go into the business of providing check cashing services and transfer of money like Western Union does, and put all these people to work doing that. And what the article said was they went out and had studied what the banks were doing, but they'd missed one small problem. And that was most of the business wasn't done by the banks. It was done by small check cashing organizations, entrepreneurial businesses, many times in inner cities and places like that. And that was the real market. And they were doing it at a very low cost, and it was not realistic that the Postal Service, with its high costs, were just going to be able to say, well, we'll take those people and let them go do a new kind of service, because people don't need snail mail the way they used to, because we got other alternatives. So that's kind of how a government would look at solving the problem. Now, is that how Jeff Bezos would have done it? He wouldn't have started with, how do I take the Postal Service organization and infrastructure and redirect it? He would start and say, okay, here's a problem. There has to be a better way. And what could that better way be? And maybe it's technology, and maybe it's people, and maybe it's better skills. Maybe it's a different end-to-end system. But the chances are you'd always start with the customer. And the problem with government is that they don't start with the customer. It's how they got in trouble with the Affordable Care Act. They were so focused on getting the votes to get it implemented that they forgot to pay attention to the fact that if people were going to adopt it, it had to be a customer story that made sense to people to want to sign up for it. And so that's why I'm not, and I'm not being political about this, I'm saying that the government could really make a difference in all of our lives if they put as much attention to the customer experience that people have as citizens with their government, and they thought through these different types of services and thought through it the eyes of the customer, much as we in the free enterprise system have to think about the customer, or our businesses don't survive. So that's a little bit of the context that I wanted to talk about. And now I want to talk more specifically about some marketing experiences I've had along the way, because we are all products of our experience. And I can tell you that it's very easy to talk about successes. People, when they reach my point in life, like to sort of say, well, let me tell you what I did, and here are my trophies. And that's not very helpful to anybody, because your most important lessons are not about your successes, they're about your failures. In fact, you become a victim of your own success. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the lessons I learned, but I'll sort of sprinkle it with some of my failures too. So let's see if I can get these slides to work. There we go. When Don was introducing me, he talked about Pepsi Packaging. The first assignment I had when I became marketing vice president, I just turned 29 to 30, and the first assignment I was given was to come up with a better looking bottle. You can see what the Pepsi bottle looked like back in 1970 than what Pepsi had, and this was the icon, the Coke hourglass shaped bottle. It vended well. It was something everybody recognized. It was comfortable to hold in the hand. And Pepsi had tried for 12 years to come up with something, but it always ended up infringing the copyright design of the Coke bottle. So the first thing we did when I became marketing VP was to run an extended in-home product use test. Now, Pepsi had never done any quantitative analysis at that point, and I was kind of a data-driven person. So we went out to 550 homes. We visited them every week. We gave people the option to buy from us any soft drink they wanted, and we tracked what they purchased each week. And after 9 weeks, we were astounded at one fact. And that fact was that no matter how much household inventory they had the previous week, when we came back the next week and they could reorder, the household inventory was always empty. And we thought about that. We said, wait a minute, why are we trying to make a little bottle look like their little bottle when their little bottle is so good? Why don't we make a big bottle? Because our business was selling liquid, fluid ounces. And we started developing what became the first 2-liter plastic bottle. And we had the 2-liter plastic bottle 2 years in the marketplace before Coca-Cola. And it occurred at exactly the time when a new sales channel was emerging, which were called mass merchandisers and drug chains. And so we went to these new types of sales retail outlets, and they didn't want to carry soft drinks because glass bottles broke and they were messy. And so I remember going into Walmart's, and back then Sam Walton was still in charge, and I came in with a plastic bottle, and I said, "How do you do, Mr. Walton? I want to show you this new Pepsi package," and I dropped it intentionally. And it bounced, and everybody in the room gasped. And that was my presentation. And he said, "What is that?" And I said, "It's a plastic bottle, Mr. Walton." And we later got Pepsi accepted in not only Walmart, but we got it into Walgreens and Kmart, into many of these new chains, CVS, that were just starting back in the early 1970s. And so that became one of Pepsi's most successful campaigns. A few years later, we went down to a part of the country where we were outsold 9-1. This is the city we picked was San Antonio, Texas. And nobody had ever, that we knew, had ever tried a Pepsi. In fact, it never even crossed their mind to have a Pepsi. And we had a local advertising agency down there. They actually came up with this idea of a taste test. We thought it was a pretty good one. So we developed it around a theme called Pepsi Challenge. And here's how it worked. We had handheld cameras. That was new in those days. They weren't even video cameras. They were just handheld film cameras. And so unlike the Pepsi generation, which was high production values, we wanted this to look realistic. And so we would set up taste test booths around town, and then we would film them. And I remember one in particular, we had a grandmother and her little granddaughter, and she was going to take the taste test, and we were set up to film this. And we were really not interested in what Pepsi drinkers thought about the taste test, because we'd done a blind test, and we knew that statistically Pepsi would win by a small amount over Coke if presented in the right conditions, as long as you didn't tell people what the brand was. Put the brand on it, Coke always won. But don't put the brand on it, just say, cup A, cup B, and Pepsi would typically win 56-44 against Coca-Cola, even down in the deep South where Coke dominated. So in this market, we were outsold 9-1, where this grandmother had never had a Pepsi before. Here's what the commercial looked like. The commercial opens where someone says, "I'd like you to take the Pepsi challenge." And the grandmother says, "I've never had a Pepsi in my life." And the little granddaughter is just sitting there staring. So we have a couple of cameras, and we're looking at the granddaughter and the grandmother and then the person administering the test. And then the grandmother takes a sip of one, she takes a sip of the other. It's blind product test, so she doesn't really know what she's drinking. And then at the end, they do the reveal. At the reveal, the little granddaughter says, "Grandma, you picked Pepsi." And the grandma says, "I can't believe it. I never had one in my life, but it tasted delicious." Bang, 7 seconds. That's all we wanted, was that 7 seconds of the experience of that grandmother. Just like Pepsi generation was about the experience of the baby boomers having a great time, this was the experience of a Coke drinker who never in their life thought about drinking anything but Coke, suddenly discovered that they picked Pepsi over Coke. And so experience marketing became something which, when I met Steve Jobs and we talked about this amazing product he was creating to be called Macintosh, and this was going to be the world's first easy-to-use media computer. Remember, back in this era, not only weren't people not using personal computers, they were just starting to with the IBM PC and the Apple II, but they were number crunchers in those days. And then Steve Jobs had this idea, no, a computer should be a media appliance. and it was all about media experience. And so he wanted to have a really easy-to-use experience. So he loved the idea of experience marketing. So we transposed what we learned with Pepsi marketing over to Apple. And we eventually launched the Macintosh with a Super Bowl commercial in January 1984. And it looked something like this. There were these guys marching into a big hall about the size of this auditorium. And they have pajama suits on. And it's shot in a sepia, so there's really not much color to the scene at all. And it cuts from these people with lobotomies, looking up at a big screen, and down the aisle comes this beautiful athletic woman who is dressed in color, and she has a hammer in her hand, and as she looks up forward, there is the thought police talking from the screen. George Orwell said back in 1948 that in 1984 that the world would be controlled by those who are in the government, who are looking out for society, and therefore we must know everything about you, and talking in monotone. And they were the thought police. And the zombies are listening, and the girl is running down the hall, and as she swings the hammer, and you look at the face of the thought police, and as it hits the screen, it explodes, and you never see a product at all. You just see the words on January 24th, 1984. Apple will introduce Macintosh, and 1984 won't be like 1984. And we ran that commercial once. It cost us $1 million. And fortunately, it was run over and over and over by the networks because no one had ever seen anything like this. We got about $45 million of free advertising. And what amazed people in Silicon Valley was that it didn't talk about technology. This was a time when there wasn't marketing dollars spent on technology, and people would talk about how many bits and bytes that they had in a computer and what model number it was and things like this. And here we were introducing a product to shape a new industry, and we never even showed the product. We set up an expectation, and expectation precedes reality. And we wanted to paint a reality that was inspiring without trying to talk about it in detail. And that was the beginning of a whole new era, which was media appliances. So let me talk about what I've learned it takes to be a successful visionary leader. I've been around some successful visionary leaders. It starts with curiosity. And many of those people had curiosity stories going back to their early childhood. They wanted to know why things worked the way they did. And couldn't there be a better way? They became passionate about changing the world. Now, when I went to Silicon Valley in 1982, the idea of changing the world had never even crossed my mind. Remember, my world was about the cola wars. Pepsi fighting against Coke for market share, shelf space, competing for best campaigns. So we never even dreamed of changing the world. And yet here were these people out in this little place called Silicon Valley that almost nobody had heard of back in 1982 unless you lived there. And they were talking passionately about changing the world. And they had the courage to make mistakes. They tried things and they didn't work, and no one got upset. They'd say, well, what did you learn? Try again. And that was a culture that to this day is still unique to America. And there was an attitude that you never give up. You fall down, you make mistakes, your back is against the wall, you learn how to recover, but you never, ever, ever give up. And that's what it's like to be an entrepreneur. So if you think about the things that happen in a technology world, somebody has to be the decider. Somebody has to make decisions. And there is no democracy in the world of entrepreneurship. So if you're looking for democracy, you won't find it in entrepreneurial companies. You'll find great cultures, you'll find inclusion, you'll find collaboration, you'll find great attitude, you'll find morale is terrific, but someone has to be the decider. And because you're trying to do things differently, in many cases you're trying to not just shape a new business, you're trying to shape an entire new industry, it's binary. Things are black and white. And many things that Steve Jobs decided were completely arbitrary. And often they were wrong. But he made decisions, and he was more often right than he was wrong. And he had this unique ability to connect the dots and to see, the possibilities of what things could be. You have to be able to recruit exceptional people to the team. Well, how do you do that? Well, you do that because you can inspire people who are talented to want to be on your team. Hire C people, they'll hire C people. Hire A people, they'll recruit A people. It's just that simple. So you can look at companies and tell very quickly which are the ones that have the more likely chance of succeeding, just by talking to the people. How do they think about what they're doing? How do they think about each other? Are they on the same bus? Do they know what their seat is on the bus? And is there a cultural tone? And I got to tell you, when I went to Silicon Valley, I'd never heard of this idea that you could be tone deaf and the culture counted, because it wasn't important to us. Back in the world I came from, what was important was competition, succeeding. And every year, the lowest 10% of performers were washed out. That was the Pepsi model. It was the GE model, back in those days. Well, that isn't the Silicon Valley model, and it clearly is not the model that we see in many of the most successful companies today. So, innovation needs to be disruptive, but if it's disruptive, what's it replacing? What is it that it's disrupting? So, for example, if you think of iTunes, it had to disrupt what came before it, which is like music CDs. Or if you think of the iPad, it wasn't replacing the PC, it was actually shaping an entirely new kind of an industry, which was about getting media information wirelessly in a very great, simple experience. So it did something different than personal computers did. And visionary leadership requires that you be able to see the possibilities long before they become obvious. One of the great definitions, I think, of genius is being able to see the obvious 20 years before the rest of us. And if you think about it, there are many things that are obvious to us today, but I can tell you they weren't obvious 30 years ago. Online banking wasn't obvious. ATM machines wasn't obvious. Smartphones wasn't obvious. Yet they're completely obvious. We can't imagine if somebody took away our smartphone, what our life would be like. So let's talk about two of the greatest examples of these principles, Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. Remember, I worked with them when they were 27 years old. Yesterday was Steve Jobs' 59th birthday, if he were alive. So this was a long time ago. And they both believed in what they called the noble cause. And I'd never heard of that idea either. Again, we put together business plans, we had budgets, we measured performance, we measured market share. Noble cause, but that's what they thought about. And their noble cause was one they were in complete agreement about. And the noble cause was make computers personal. Now, this is a time when Ken Olsen, founder and CEO of Digital Equipment Company, was saying, why would anybody want their own computer? What would they do with it? Now, you don't know that because you've grown up with personal computers, but I can tell you the idea that somebody would want their own computer, 32 years ago was an absurd idea. Why would anybody possibly want a computer? Because the idea then was a computer was this thing that was in a big air-conditioned glass room, and what in the world would you do if you had your own computer? Well, they said, no, computer should be personal. We should write something called shrink-wrap software. Bill Gates invented that whole concept, shrink-wrap software, that you, back in an era when hardware was all that you got money for computers, you gave the software for free. Bill said, no, we're going to charge for the software. The hardware will eventually become a commodity, and we're going to put it in the little boxes and call it shrink-wrap software and sell it for very high margins, like 95% gross margins. And he built a whole industry around that. And he licensed out the operating system, something that had never been done before. So Bill and Steve said, we can change the world one person at a time. That seemed outrageous to me because I was used to mass marketing, mass television, mass campaigns all over the world. change the world one person at a time. What in the world are you talking about, guys? You know, and yet they totally believed in this as a noble cause. Now that's where their agreement ended. And I would sit there and they would argue over and over again. I can't tell you the number of times that the three of us would sit there and they were the smart guys who understood this industry. I was just learning about it. And they saw it completely different. You know, Steve's idea was, you got to talk in metaphors. You got to make it approachable to people. So he called the Macintosh a bicycle for the mind. You know, he had a gift of being able to articulate things in ways that were inspiring. And people said, wow, you're not talking bits and bytes, you're talking about a bicycle for the mind. I'm not sure I know what that is, but it sure sounds incredible. He would talk about the Mac was insanely great. I mean, I'd never heard those two words put together, insane and great. You know, and he talked about things being insanely great. And he said it's all about an end-to-end system. He created desktop publishing. This idea that you could take beautiful fonts and you could render them on a machine that you could see on the screen what were going to be printed out on a printer, and it would all look the same, and it could be done by an individual, and you become your own publisher. I mean, this is bigger than Gutenberg creating movable type. So Steve's idea was no compromises. Everything had to be perfect. You had to control everything, end to end. Bill, on the other hand, would said it's all about software. And he invented, the licensing model, shrink-wrap software, and it was all about land grab. And he was willing to compromise anything he had to compromise as long as you used his software. And both of them built very successful companies, but two entirely different marketing strategies of how to do it. So what are the lessons from this? One is that these kinds of leaders are constantly thinking about there has to be a better way. I think about that all the time because I'm a person with insatiable curiosity. Doesn't mean I always come up with a better way to do it, but I think about it all the time. We just launched a new company called 1-800-Razors back in the end of last year, and we essentially are selling a very high-quality 5-blade razor for half the price of the major brand. And the business is booming. Why? Because razor blades are really expensive. You can spend about $500 to $600 a year buying 5-blade razors. And if you go into a drugstore, you see it's a pretty complicated buying process because it's locked behind a glass panel because it's the most pilfered product in the drugstore if you don't lock it behind a glass panel. So disruptive price, better experience, different ways of doing the marketing. In that case, we use direct response television. Is an example of a better way. You also, if you want to build a new business that's a billion-dollar business, you better solve a billion-dollar problem. Sometimes people come to me and say, look, I've got this new invention. Will you help me with it? And I said, well, but that's an invention. What's the business? What problem are you solving? I said, well, I don't know yet, but I know it's a great invention. It doesn't make any difference what the invention is. Technology commoditizes so quickly. Think about the problem first. Make it a big, juicy problem if you want to build, a big, successful business. So try to define a billion-dollar problem, and then you got to get the right people sitting on the right seats on the bus, and build trust between them. Being an entrepreneur is about make things happen. It's not about contemplating or thinking about stuff. It's about make things happen, and you only do that with teams. It's never done by just one person. You may have read Richard Florida's books on the creative economy. It's a lot of really great insight. The creative economy is really about free agent nation. Another statistic that doesn't get well noted when they report the unemployment statistics is that over half the jobs that are added each time we get an employment report are temporary jobs. Now, no one likes to talk about that because they'd like you to think that all the new jobs are permanent jobs. It used to be the temporary jobs were the job that you had between a permanent job and another permanent job. Well, that's not true anymore. We're now finding, remember I said you've got these higher skilled people who are in middle management. Well, what happens when they're out of a job? Where do they go? A lot of them are discovering that they can join free agent nation. that they can become independent contractors. Why? Because more and more work is being done on a project basis, and projects are being put out to bid over the internet, and people can bid, to be able to do that project. And it's a booming industry, and it's entrepreneurial, and it takes exactly the kind of skills that many of these people who are in middle management are now doing as independent contractors. And by the way, a lot of them are making a lot more money than they ever did when they were sitting in with the authority to say no in the middle management of these giant corporations. So there's hope that America can adapt, because we are the most adaptive country in the world. We're pragmatic, we are willing to try things and make mistakes, and we're curious, and we are creative. And this ability to adapt is one of America's greatest resources. And this permission to fail. What will surprise you is that Bill Gates has failed time and time again. But you don't hear about the failures, you only hear of Bill's extraordinary successes. These are some of the products Bill failed at. He failed at Windows 1.0. So he came back and did Windows 2.0. He failed with Windows 2.0. But he got it right on Windows 3.0, and he became, as you know, the wealthiest person in the world. He came out with mobile. He missed what Steve Jobs did with his mobile products, so he failed with a series of mobile products, and he failed with his first Surface tablet. So those were failures, but he didn't give up, came back, and Microsoft, people always say they miss it the first time, they miss it the second time, but they get it right the third time. And they've done that over and over again, decade after decade. Well, Steve Jobs failed too. When I joined Apple, it had just introduced the Apple III the year before, total failure. Introduced Lisa after that, total failure. Only thing left was the Apple II. 7 years old, sales going down. So my job was to help turn around the Apple II. Knew nothing about computer technology, but I was working on turning around the Apple II. Steve was building the Mac. I had nothing to do with designing the Mac, because I had no skills to do that. But when Steve came out with the Macintosh Office in 1985, total failure. Why? Because microprocessors weren't fast enough to do all the things he wanted. Steve left. A year later, processors were powerful enough. We renamed the Mac Office Desktop Publishing, and it was a wild success. Still Steve's idea, but the timing was right the next time around. Steve went off, started Next, his first product, total failure, the Next Cube. But ultimately, what happened to Next? The operating system of Next became the future operating system of Apple when Steve came back in 1997. So often your failures become the basis of your later successes. So let me give you just finally some examples of there has to be a better way, and how to build a billion-dollar business. I'm working in the healthcare world, and what I'm passionate about is the opportunity for digital health in what many have described as the consumer era of healthcare. So in healthcare, we've had this healthcare system since the end of the Second World War, which is an employer-based health plan that's tax-free. We have 150 million American workers who enjoy this and their families. And this is now coexisting with another healthcare system called the Affordable Care Act, which is an entitlement system with mandates. So whether you like the new system or not is immaterial, because it's the law. And so these two systems are coexisting next to each other, and they're causing derivative effects. One of the derivative effects is that in this large healthcare industry, where there are 900 million face-to-face doctor visits a year, and the average person visits a doctor 3 times a year, that the wait time has been about 23 days in 49 of our 50 states, except one state, Massachusetts, where it's 63 days. And as you project out into the future, what might our healthcare system be for primary care physician visits? Well, as we add 30 million more people to the healthcare system, the chances are it's not going to be 23 days. It's probably going to be longer, and the estimates are we're 65,000 doctors short, primary care physicians, and the American Medical Association says that about 70% of these face-to-face doctor visits probably aren't even necessary. that you could do a lot of that online. So the multi-billion-dollar problem is, in a world where deductibles are going up, and it used to be deductibles were relatively small, and then the copay would kick in. Now it's more typical that the deductibles are $5,000 a year. So imagine you're paying $16,000 for your health plan, which for most people is a pretty big number, and then the first $5,000 you pay out of pocket every year. Now that gets expensive. And no one's known what health care has cost because it's an industry that has no transparency on prices, and we didn't really have to care because 150 million people got health insurance as a tax-free benefit, and the copays kicked in so early. Well, that's not true anymore. So now that creates a real opportunity with these 30 million more covered lives moving into the system to say, how could we do things differently? And one of the companies that I'm involved with is a telehealth company called MD Live. We give immediate access to doctors and nurses. We have about 2,300 doctors. We're in all 50 states. We can do refills or write new prescriptions. So let's say you're traveling to Disney World and your kid is 8 years old and they have an earache and it's 9 o'clock at night, and what do? Well, call MD Live and you can get a doctor pretty immediately. And if the doctor determines that prescription is required, the doctor can write a script and you can pick it up at the closest pharmacy, and you look on the internet and see where the closest pharmacy is. And so we can offer that type of service at a much lower price because we're doing it with a very different business model. And so we can make money at $40 where typical doctor visits, they may or may not make money at $120 a visit. And we can give big discounts on the lab work when that's required, up to 50%. And we can give big discounts on the prescription products if they use generic products, typically 50, 60% discounts. And we offer other types of coaching services for things like depression and anxiety and smoking cessation and alcohol abuse and things like that. So all of these things can be done using technology. We have, as our spokesperson, Dr. Travis Stork. Some of you may have seen him on television. He's the lead celebrity doctor on a daily show called The Doctors. And he and Dr. Oz and Sanjay Gupta are probably the best known doctors, thanks to television. And so Dr. Stork is our spokesperson, but everything we do online is focused on the mobile device. So all of this is available over the mobile device. And I just finally want to just give you an idea of how we think about it. Now, remember, I'm a marketing person. So what do marketing people think about? We think about the customer. We measure everything from the perspective of the customer. So to us, the most important metric is customer satisfaction. So we monitor everything with our customer experience. And we said, there's nothing we can compare to in healthcare that we can use as a role model. So where did we go? We said, well, let's see, who does great customer experience? Amazon does great customer experience. Apple Genius Bar does great customer experience in an Apple store. But there's not much to point to in the healthcare industry. So we started modeling ourselves on that much higher aspiration. So we don't outsource our call centers. They're all our people. We train everybody rigorously. We have to live with the different regulations that are different in every one of the 50 states. We have doctors who go through a rigorous credentialing. We monitor every session. We have nurses who do triage. The worst thing would be is if somebody has something that they really should go to an emergency department, and we don't point them to the emergency department, but we try to handle it online. I mean, that'd be unethical as well as a huge medical liability risk. So we're rigorous on the triage process. And at the end of every session with a patient, we call the patient back and ask them to review the quality of the session. So here's how our customers rank us. 97% satisfaction. The physicians love being part of this process. Typical physician primary practice doctor makes $104,000 a year. Our doctors make $140,000 to $180,000 a year. They can handle more patients, and they can do it from home, do it electronically. We get you a doctor 10 minutes after you call for one. We've had no malpractice claims at this point. The typical session time is 13 minutes. And people say that they would recommend us again. 90% say we resolved the issue that they wanted to see resolved, and 97% they would recommend to family and friends. And we actually use, for the sake of time, I won't go through it, something called Net Promoter Score that some of you in marketing may be familiar with, where you ask people to rate a service on a 10-point scale. You take a 9 and 10, the highest, you sum that. You take scores of 6 and below, sum that, you subtract the 6 and below scores from the 9 and 10. That tells you what your net promoter score is. And the, let's say AT&T has about a 33 score on that measurement, 33%, whereas Apple and Amazon are up around 70%. Our score is 67, so we're right up there in the same space. Southwest Airline, MD Live, Apple, and Amazon are the highest rated. And this is a brand new company. The question is, can we scale it and still keep that quality of experience? So here are the lessons. My life in marketing began with this insight from Dr. Margaret Mead about this new kind of middle-class consumer who was the first person to have discretionary income. The early days of the middle-class lifestyle back in 1969. And I've lived with that middle-class market for my entire working life, whether it's in other parts of the world or here in the United States. And we have a middle-class economy that's based on consumption, that's been conspicuous. We got to learn to adapt to frugal. You can adapt to frugal as long as you don't compromise on the customer experience. You can give people a great customer experience, but you've got to dramatically change the business structure, the end-to-end system of how you deliver it, or you can't make money at a disruptive price. And Amazon is a good example of that, and I could give you others. And then you've got to recognize that there are things going on in technology that give us tools to accomplish these things that weren't even possible 5 or 6 years ago. Big data analytics, the power of Internet of Things with billions of sensors coming our way, and unstructured data analytics. And then if you look at how you can start to rethink what the shape of an organization will look like, and what I've learned is that size is no assurance of success. My final story is about failure. In this case, when I left Apple, I was asked to come in and take a look at Kodak by the then new CEO, who I'd worked with when he was CEO of Motorola back when I was at Apple. And this is a very smart man. He was a PhD, he worked at Bell Labs, he'd been CEO of Motorola. And he said, "What do you think?" And this is back in the 1990s. I said, "Well, I think the future is not about picture taking, it's about picture making. And picture making is what you do with digital. And picture taking is the whole business for traditional chemical-based silver halide photography." I said, "Why don't you go off?" Kodak had a market cap in those days of $20 billion. I said, "Why don't you buy Adobe?" It was about a little over $1 billion market cap. "Why don't you buy Lexmark, about the same size, and get into the picture-making business, tools and printing and things like that?" And Kodak thought about it, and they said, "We're chemists. This is what we know, and we're pretty confident that we can continue to build our business around what we know." So they doubled down on chemistry. They put all their marketing spend behind single-use cameras. And then along came, a few years later, the ability with 3G to do photos off a smartphone, and they were pretty darn good, and you could send it to people over a wireless network. And Kodak had a Kodak moment. And my advice is, you don't want a Kodak moment. So you've got to be curious. You've got to be a risk taker. You've got to be passionate. Hopefully you'll find a noble cause. If you can't find one, go work with someone who has. The future of this country is about the future of the things that makes America great. We're entrepreneurs. We're pragmatic. We like to build things. We like to make things happen. And the growth of our economy, this is still the greatest economy in the world, the growth of our economy. Just increase it by 1% of GDP, just 1%. You can change the entire future of this country, 1% a year. And that could easily be done by reducing the regulations on small business, by opening up more opportunities for the free enterprise system to have a chance to grow, by improving the opportunities for all kinds of people. The great thing about our country is that we are made up of so many immigrants, and we're made up of so many different cultures, and that we assimilate well, better than any other country in the world. So I'm a big believer, I'm a capitalist. People say, what are your politics? I'm a capitalist. And I believe in the free enterprise system. I believe in giving capital to solving big problems. I also think we have responsibilities as citizens, that we can't ignore, particularly if we're successful. But I believe in the free enterprise system, and I believe it can be best achieved through entrepreneurs. So I hope somewhere in this audience that there are people who want to be entrepreneurs, that you're inspired to go out and try to build businesses that can change the world. It is totally possible. You can do it. But it's not easy. It's hard work. And the thing you have to make the decision on, and I see it around the world, is I have a brother who lives in France. I said, so what do your neighbors do? He said, I don't have the slightest idea. I've lived here 7 years, and we've never talked about what they do. You see, in France, people work to live. In our culture, we live to work. Why do I still work? Because I love it. I don't do the heavy lifting. I don't run the companies anymore. I mentor. I get to work on a number of different projects. I'm curious. I'm another set of trusted eyes, hopefully. My first criteria is I only work with people I like. Therefore, they have to like me, or that's not going to work. So if you can't get past that, for them and for me, then that's not going to happen. So I have a ball. This is the best time of my entire life. But work is part of the culture that I enjoy. That's unique in this country. It's not going away. And you who are involved in marketing and business, I think appreciate that, or you wouldn't be here doing what you're doing. So that's my message tonight. Feel good about the future. You can play a big role, and some of you may actually even change the world. Thank you.